this series of videos, we'll look at how the English governed their colonies in the 17th century and how the colonies sort of developed north and south differently. And we'll conclude with how there were internal tensions within the colonies. But in this first video, we're going to focus just on the English Empire, and it's based, of course, on the practice of mercantilism. So we'll look at how they implemented mercantilism. I think it's important first to remind you what mercantilism was. It was a way that colonies could benefit the mother country, and it's based on certain assumptions. And I've been through this in earlier videos, but again, this is a good reminder. They believed that all the wealth in the world was limited. Wealth was determined by precious metal, like gold and silver, which we can call specie. And, the amount of specie in the world is limited. And no country, of course, was self-sufficient. So if you needed things, you had to buy it from competing countries. And that meant specie, gold and silver, was leaving. What you wanted was to sell more stuff and have specie coming in than buying more stuff and having specie going out. So colonies are a way that the mother countries could provide things that the mother country needs, and without having the mother country specie go to competing nations. So the idea was that the colonies can provide raw materials the mother country doesn't have, and the colonies, they're out there in the wild, they have a lot of natural resources, but they don't have any manufacturing, any finished products, and so they would get those from the mother country. So in a sense, the mother country could buy the raw materials and things they don't have from the colonies, not competitors, and the specie would go to the colonies, and then the colonies would in turn need finished products, and they would use that specie to buy from the mother country. And the specie, the gold and silver, would therefore stay within the mother country system. It would not go to competing nations. And mercantilism, they're going to implement a number of rules over the colonies to ensure that this trade was operating in the benefit of the mother countries. In theory, it benefited both the colonies and the mother country, but of course it was all geared at keeping the mother country's specie within the mother country's realm. The first country really to implement a mercantilist policy was the first country to really develop a colonial empire in North America, Spain. And initially, of course, Spain, they just extracted specie, gold, from the colonies themselves, which is the best thing for the mother country. But as the 16th century, the 1500s began to wear on, the Spanish recognized the value of their colonies in the Caribbean to grow sugar. Now, sugar wasn't able to grow in Europe and was valuable for making molasses and alcohol. The Spanish established a system of large plantations and comunidad, granted by the king and ruled by his appointed governors. These governors strictly enforced rules designed to prevent other nations from getting into that sugar market. The key to mercantilism was, of course, as I've said, controlling trade. And the Spanish maintained a so-called House of Trade that granted a monopoly on the sugar trade to a merchant guild in the city of Seville. The House of Trade demanded all gold and sugar now be shipped only on Spanish ships and only to designated ports, because if the gold were sent from a Spanish colony to Spain on a foreign ship, it might not get to Spain. And so if they said it had to come to designated ports, they can keep track of it better. By the 17th century, the 1600s, the growth of the English colonies had created a demand for tobacco and in time other products, indigo and things we'll talk about later on. But the English, of course, wanted to establish some mercantilist controls over their raw materials coming to Europe, and so they passed a number of laws that were very important, known as the Navigation Acts. It was first controlled by what they call the Lords of Trade, and its membership, as its name's implied, was appointed from wealthy English businessmen. Obviously, this businessman had a self-interest and were going to act in the best interest of their own businesses. Late in the 17th century, in 1696, it was made broader and at least a bit more representative with more members, and it became known as the Board of Trade. Its official name was the Lord Commissioners of Trade and Plantations. The colonists technically had, no say in these navigation laws. The Lords of Trade and the Board of Trade were controlling it, and the boards of trade had later more expanded powers. Technically, they could review all the acts and laws passed by any colonial legislators dealing with the economy to make sure that they fit within their mercantilist policies of the mother country. It had the veto power over colonial legislators, which the colonists really hated. In reality, however, for most of the colonial period, the Board of Trade did not veto many colonial laws. It only vetoed 496 out of almost 9,000 colonial laws that it reviewed. And what we're going to see is that the British, the English, and then the British, they really only were interested in controlling trade, and a lot of the colonist colonial legislatures began to govern in regard to their own lives otherwise. But when it comes to controlling the trade, that's what the Board of Trade was really interested in, and it strictly enforced the Navigation Acts. The first Navigation Act was passed in 1660, and it mandated that all trade must be in an English ship with an English captain and a crew 3/4 English. While the colonists were considered English, the law was obviously to ensure that ships once on the high seas stayed loyal. It also listed what they called enumerated articles. They could only be exported out of the colonies to England, not to other countries. Obviously, these were natural resources the mother country needed and would have to buy from other competing countries if they didn't get it from the colonies. In time, it included things like sugar, ginger, cotton, indigo, dyewoods, and tobacco. We'll talk more about those products later. 3 years later, in 1663, they passed another Navigation Act that said all goods from Europe to the colonies had to first go through England. Obviously, that was to ensure that everything the colonists got, they got by paying their specie to England and not to competitors. 10 years later, they passed the Navigation Act of 1673, which is also known as the Plantation Duty Act. It required that colonial merchants pay a tax, or as they called it, a duty, on certain enumerated articles shipped from one colony to another, sort of intercolonial trade. In this way, a merchant couldn't simply say, hey, I'm sailing from one colonial port to another, and then head off to France or Spain or one of the other countries' competing nations. Lastly, 20 years later after that, the problems of enforcing these legislation had become apparent, and they passed the Navigation Act of 1696. It provided for the establishment of admiralty courts with jurisdiction over violators of any of the earlier navigation acts. It could enforce the mercantilistic laws on trade. In regard to money in the mercantilistic system, early in the colonial period, the English wanted to keep as much of their specie, their gold and silver coins, in England as possible, and thus they tried to avoid sending a lot of such coins to the American colonies. They relied a lot on what you call bills of exchange, which are English banknotes, promises that if you took the note to a bank, you could get gold and specie. Well, the banks would issue these notes, saying that anybody who had a note could go to their bank and exchange it for gold and specie. Well, this had been used as paper money. People were promising, that they would sell this paper note for a good or product. Anyway, the English would pay the colonies in bills of exchange, paper money, essentially. The English also wanted to prevent the development of colonial banks that might start creating the colony's own wealth. And as a result, early in the colonial period, bartering sometimes took place of money in colonial transactions given the shortage of British specie coins. As the colonists grew, such English restrictions diminished and payments to the colonies grew in British specie. On the left, you can see a British bill of exchange, and on the right, they're showing the hogsheads of tobacco as an example of bartering. They used tobacco. As I've said, given that mercantilist laws officially prevented colonial trade with foreign countries, illegal trade still took place and foreign coins made their way into the English colonies. With their interest in trade alone, the English didn't try to prevent the influx of foreign coins into the colonies, and in fact, in time, they accepted foreign coins from their colonists and trade with them. It made sense, as foreign coins meant additional specie, wealth, coming into the English mercantilist system. And if it's a foreign coin, it's a competitor species. It's coming into your system. As a matter of fact, interestingly, the term dollar was used to describe one such coin, a Spanish coin that made its way into the English mercantilist system. As time passed and the colonies grew and developed, however, banks were still discouraged by the English, but in some colonies, they just simply began to print their own money. Massachusetts was the first colony to do so. Other northern colonies followed, but they were always careful, however, to print only small amounts of that paper money, and they could limit what it could be used for. And they also often stipulated a deadline date when it had to be exchanged for something of real value, something of specie. Many southern colonies, however, in time began to print money without any such restrictions, and they just kind of flooded the economy with their own paper money, and inflation exploded. The English, of course, meanwhile, would not accept such money in payment of taxes, as you can understand. Massachusetts was the first colony also that tried to coin its own money, and the first coin was the so-called pine tree shilling. It contained less silver than the English shilling, even though the colonial government argued that it had the same value. Uh, the British would say coining your own money was considered was illegal because they wanted the specie again controlled by Britain. This controls the first. This concludes the first video on how the English tried to govern trade according to mercantilist policies and how money operated within this mercantilist system.